He knew he was already dead long before his plane began to fall. March 24, 1945, 22,000 feet above the German countryside near Kassel, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler sat inside the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf-109, staring at an empty fuel gauge and realizing his fate was sealed. His engine coughed, sputtered, and finally choked on fumes that no longer existed. Beneath him lay nearly 50 miles of enemy-controlled territory with no hope of crossing it alive. Behind him, his own airfield was far beyond reach. Around him, the sky belonged entirely to American fighters. His hands trembled on the controls, not from the brutal cold at altitude, but from the certainty of what would come next. He had heard the stories. American pilots didn't just shoot you down. They circled your parachute to finish the job. They strafed you while you dangled helplessly, or waited until you reached the ground and turned you into target practice. Animals, his commander had called them. Merciless. Franz believed it. They all did. That was what they had been told. Below, the patchwork of farmland and scattered villages crawled with Allied soldiers, tanks, and anti-aircraft guns. The Americans had been driving across Europe for months, their anger justified and earned. Franz had no illusions. If they caught him, they had every reason to hate him. The Bf-109 sputtered again, then went silent. The propeller spun uselessly in the rushing wind. He was gliding now. No engine, no thrust, only wings and gravity pulling him closer to the earth. In the distance, he spotted a former Luftwaffe airfield, now captured and used by the Americans. Rows of foreign aircraft and support vehicles filled the grounds. There might be a runway he could reach, but even if he survived the descent, what then? Capture? Interrogation? Or something far worse? His thoughts flashed to his mother and younger sister back in Bavaria. If he didn't make it home, they would receive a telegram marked "Missing in Action." No answers, no closure. They would never know if he had burned in the sky or been gunned down. Movement caught his eye. Two tiny specks in his rearview mirror, growing larger every moment. Silver, fast, Mustangs, P-51s, the best fighters the Americans had. Franz felt his stomach turn to ice. They had seen him, and now they were closing in. He didn't bother reaching for the trigger. There was no point. He was helpless. He braced himself, praying for a quick end. But death didn't come. One of the Mustangs pulled up beside him, close, impossibly close, barely 50 feet off his wingtip. Franz turned his head. Through the glass canopy, he saw the pilot clearly. An American, young, probably no older than he was. The pilot looked straight at him. There was no hatred in his eyes, no movement toward the trigger, just watching. Then the American did something Franz could not comprehend. He pointed downward, not threateningly, not mockingly. It was a gesture, almost like direction, guidance. Franz blinked. Was this a trick? Some twisted game before the kill? Then the second Mustang pulled up on his other side. He was boxed in between them, flanked by enemy fighters, yet neither fired a shot. His powerless Bf-109 continued its slow descent, 18,000 feet. The lead Mustang pointed downward again, more firmly this time, toward the captured airfield. Then he made another gesture, palms down, slowly pressing toward the earth. Land. Franz could hardly process it. These Americans, his sworn enemies, were guiding him down. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this. None of the stories mentioned compassion.
At 15,000 feet, the airfield grew closer. He could see the runways clearly now, American ground crews moving about. He knew what awaited him if he landed. Imprisonment, humiliation, perhaps far worse. Every film, every speech, every warning had said the same thing: better to die than surrender to the Americans. But his engine was dead. His choices had evaporated. 10,000 feet. The Mustangs still escorted him without firing. 8,000, 5,000. Sweat soaked through his gloves. His heart thundered against his ribs. Still, the Americans did nothing. At 3,000 feet, the lead Mustang rocked its wings in a signal, then peeled away. The second Mustang followed, leaving him alone with the runway. They had given him a chance. He lowered the landing gear manually. No hydraulics remained. The landing would be rough, but he was alive, and someone out there had chosen mercy when they had every reason not to. Franz's Messerschmitt slammed down onto the American runway, bouncing hard before settling into a long, powerless glide. Without an engine or functioning brakes, he could only watch as the aircraft skidded across the concrete, finally shuddering to a halt near the far end. Then came the heavy silence. Franz sat frozen in the cockpit, heartbeat pounding, hands locked around the control stick. Soon he saw American jeeps racing toward him. This was the moment he had dreaded. Capture, humiliation, perhaps worse. He considered drawing his pistol for a final act, a soldier's end. But then he remembered the Mustangs, the pilot who had looked him in the eye and allowed him to live. Maybe not today. He slowly raised his hands, deliberate, calm. The canopy creaked open. The first American to reach the aircraft was a sergeant, sidearm drawn, but not aimed. "Out!" he barked. Then, in broken German, "Raus! Langsam!" Franz obeyed, legs shaking as he climbed down from the cockpit. He braced for shouting, a rifle butt to the back, something violent. Instead, the sergeant reached forward and steadied him. "Easy there, buddy. You okay? Verletzt?" The question stunned Franz. Was the man actually asking if he was injured, and with genuine concern? "Nein," Franz managed. "Not injured." The sergeant nodded. "Good. Come on." And Franz Stigler, who had expected to die in the freezing sky minutes earlier, was guided gently toward the waiting jeep.
He had expected kicks, curses, and rifle barrels. What he got instead felt impossible. Franz Stigler wasn't dragged or shoved when they brought him from the runway. He was simply led, firmly but without hostility. One soldier sat beside him in the jeep, another across from him. None pointed a gun at him. None laid a hand on him. The vehicle smelled of cigarettes and strong army coffee. The soldier next to him offered a canteen. Franz hesitated, then finally took a drink. The water was cold and clean. He whispered, "Danke." The soldier grinned and replied, "You're welcome, pal." Warm air enveloped him as soon as they stepped inside the operations building. His flight suit, soaked with sweat and frozen stiff, began to thaw painfully. Waiting for him was an officer, mid-40s, glasses, calm and well-mannered. Captain James Mitchell. He introduced himself in flawless German. "Please, sit." Franz stared at the chair. It wasn't a metal interrogation stool. It was a cushioned office chair. On the desk were a steaming mug of coffee and 2 precious cubes of real sugar. "Would you like some?" Mitchell asked, already pouring. Franz could only nod. The cup burned his fingertips. The smell struck him like a forgotten memory. Childhood mornings before the war. His first sip scalded his tongue, but he didn't care. It was the best thing he had tasted in years. "You met a couple of our better pilots today," Mitchell said, settling across from him. "Captain Joe Henderson and Lieutenant Charlie Brennan, 357th Fighter Group. They saw you'd lost your engine. Figured you might prefer to live through the day." Franz stared into his cup. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Why didn't they shoot me?" Mitchell frowned in genuine confusion. "Because you were defenseless. What kind of men do you think we are?" Franz didn't know how to answer. Everything he had ever been told about American cruelty, about what awaited prisoners, was being undone sip by sip. After the interview, he was taken not to a cage, not to a concrete cell, but to a converted barracks with bunks, blankets, and a working stove. 12 other German airmen were already there,
all recently captured, all wearing the same stunned expression he felt on his own face. A medic soon arrived, an American, calm and professional. He checked Franz's hands. "Frostbite," the interpreter explained. "We'll treat this." Franz insisted he was fine. The medic treated him anyway, bandaging his fingers, spreading soothing cream, wrapping him in a wool blanket. Then came the food, an American K-ration, canned meat, crackers, chocolate, cigarettes. The moment he tasted the chocolate, Franz felt tears rise. It tasted like a world without war. That night, he couldn't sleep. His mind kept circling the same thought, again and again. Why? Why mercy? Why kindness? Why were his enemies treating him with more dignity than his own command had shown in years? This was not weakness. These were the victors, the ones who held every advantage. They had chosen restraint simply because it was the right thing to do. That shook him more deeply than threats ever could. The days that followed were nothing like the nightmare he had expected. In the temporary POW camp, he was treated not as a hated enemy, but as a man who had fought and lost. The barracks were simple but warm, meals were regular, medical treatment continued without hesitation. Even the guards, young Americans with rifles slung casually over their shoulders, acted more like careful neighbors than men guarding prisoners. There were rules, but those rules were enforced with professionalism, not cruelty. Surreal did not begin to describe it. One of the guards, a teenager from Nebraska named Tommy, struck up a halting conversation with Franz. Between broken English and broken German, they traded slang, jokes, even a few curses, laughing whenever one of them butchered a word. Franz laughed openly for the first time in years. One evening, swing music floated across the camp from a radio. Glenn Miller. Franz's foot tapped involuntarily, old memories awakening. A guard noticed. "You like swing?" he asked, surprised. Franz nodded. "Before war, I loved it." The next day, the same guard carried in a battered record player and a handful of old 78 RPM discs. Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Artie Shaw. He set it up in the common room and let the German prisoners listen. That night, former enemies sat side by side, heads bobbing in rhythm. For a few hours, the war outside dissolved, drowned out by the brass and swing, by music that didn't care what uniform a man wore. The compassion went far beyond comfort. One of the German pilots, Weber, had been shot in the leg during his capture. Franz watched American medics treat him with the same care they gave their own. Surgery, clean bandages, antibiotics. Weber survived. He eventually walked again. In a Luftwaffe-run camp, he might have lost his leg or his life. Here, his captors treated his injuries as if they truly mattered. Red Cross workers visited regularly, bringing parcels with chocolate, soap, and letters from home. The Americans allowed them to write back, censored but still permitted. Franz's letter to his mother was short. "I am alive. I am safe. The Americans treat us well. Do not believe everything you have been told." 3 weeks after his capture, a familiar face appeared at the door of the barracks. Captain Joe Henderson, the Mustang pilot who had guided him down from the sky. He carried a thermos of soup and a pack of cigarettes. "Thought you might be hungry," he said through the interpreter. Franz stood speechless. Henderson smiled. "That was some fine flying, by the way. Dead stick landing in a 10-9 on an unfamiliar runway. I've seen worse from our own boys." Franz could barely speak. They had tried to kill each other hours before. Now the American was complimenting him, offering him food, sharing warmth. Henderson reached into his wallet and pulled out a photo, a woman and 2 small children. "My wife Betty, Donna is 5, Joe Jr. just turned 3. Franz nodded softly. "I have a mother and a sister." "Then they'll be glad you made it," Henderson said. Before leaving, his expression turned serious. "I know what you were told about us, that we torture, that we hate, but that's not who we are. You'll be treated by the rules, Geneva Convention, medical care, mail. And when this war ends, and it will end, you're going home." Franz said nothing. Words failed him, but something deep inside him shifted, quietly and permanently. They offered him more than mercy. They offered him understanding, respect, and something he hadn't felt in years, dignity. What shocked Franz most was that these men weren't gentle because they were weak. They were gentle because they were strong enough to choose it. Their discipline wasn't only military, it was moral. That night, Franz wrote in his diary, "They treat us not as monsters, not as enemies, but as men. Today, I saw what honor looks like in a uniform that is not my own." Franz Stigler's life did not end on that runway in March 1945. In many ways, it began again. After 3 weeks in American custody, he was transferred to a long-term POW camp and eventually repatriated to Germany in August of that year. What he found upon returning home was devastation. His house half destroyed, his town reduced to rubble, his past shattered. His father had died fighting on the Eastern Front, but miraculously his mother and sister had survived. Franz returned not as the man who had gone to war, but as someone profoundly changed by what he had experienced, not on the battlefield, but in captivity. In the 1950s, he retrained as a commercial pilot, flying for Lufthansa as Germany slowly rebuilt. Yet no matter how many miles he logged in the sky, part of him remained frozen at 22,000 feet, suspended between life and death, remembering the moment an enemy had every right to kill him, but chose differently. For decades, Franz searched for the P-51 pilot who had spared him. He wrote letters to veterans associations across countries, reached out to archives, sent inquiries that crossed oceans. Then, in 1989, one letter made its way to him in Canada, where he had since immigrated and built a successful business. The sender was Captain Joe Henderson. They spoke. They arranged to meet, and in an airport terminal, 44 years after that moment of mercy, two old men embraced, once enemies, now bound by a single act of decency in a war built to erase it. "Thank you," Franz whispered. "You gave me my life." Henderson, ever modest, answered only, "It was the right thing to do." Their friendship endured for the rest of their lives. They exchanged family photographs, visited each other's homes, and retold their story to students, veterans, and historians. They didn't share it to glorify war. They shared it to remind the world of what humanity looks like when everything around it is trying to kill it. Franz's diary from 1945 is now preserved in a German archive. One entry stands above the rest. "Today I learned that strength is not in domination, but in mercy. That honor lives not in flags, but in choices." He repeated this line often in speeches. It became his mantra. Franz wasn't the only one who returned home with such stories. Thousands of German POWs carried similar memories: fair treatment, medical care, food, mail, even music. They saw with their own eyes the gulf between the propaganda they had been fed and the reality of American values. Many became quiet advocates for democracy in post-war Europe. America's treatment of prisoners was not accidental, it was policy. From Eisenhower down, the message was unwavering: honor the Geneva Convention, not because others do, but because we do. This wasn't only morality, it was strategy. Every humane gesture planted a seed. Seeds that later grew into allyships, partnerships, and eventually peace. By 1946, America was already thinking past victory. The Marshall Plan, NATO, a united Western bloc against Soviet expansion. None of it would have been possible without trust. And trust wasn't built in conference rooms. It was built in barracks, in chow lines, in medical tents. It was built when an American guard handed a cigarette to a captured German pilot, when a nurse sat with a wounded enemy through the night, when a Mustang pilot saw a powerless aircraft falling from the sky and chose to guide it home instead of blowing it apart. These moments weren't isolated gestures. They were the foundation stones of the post-war world.
Franz Stigler passed away in 2008, but his legacy lives on. His grandson became a pilot in the modern German Air Force. Today, he flies NATO missions wing to wing with American pilots, the living continuation of a choice made in 1945. A choice to see not an enemy, but a human being. A reminder that the way we treat the defeated often shapes the world that follows. And sometimes the greatest victories are not won with bullets at all, but with mercy. Do you have a World War II family story of enemies showing unexpected humanity? Share it in the comments. These stories matter. They show what people can be at their best. And if this one moved you, hit like, subscribe, and help us bring more forgotten acts of courage and compassion back to life.